Alright, so you've got a grant application skeleton, an elevator speech, maybe a draft summary, and a plan to approach the program officer for more suggestions and insights. Let's talk now about filling in the main part of the narrative structure, okay? A critical part of the narrative that holds it together is the detailed project plan. This should be a stepwise plan that includes all of the stages that your project will go through. Recall that I suggested that you would need 2 or 3 pages to discuss this. That's not including the many explanatory pages that should come from your discussion of how the project fills the goals of the program. That's just for the plan itself, those 2 to 3 pages. So, you've hopefully been thinking through the plan in some detail as you have built your outline, investigated your supporting literature, and made your summary. In that process, you probably thought a lot about what you will do in your project and how you will do it. It's time to think about that in even more detail. People tend to get tempted to ask for either too much or too little money in grants. Too much to get as much as they can, or too little in hopes of being more competitive. But grant reviewers see a large number of grants and have a very good sense for what resources will be needed in a project. So it's important to be carefully realistic in planning the amount requested. You might be wondering why I mention that now. Well, in thinking of the detailed plan, you want to think about the steps your project will need, the materials that will be needed to perform those steps, the funding for activities that you may need, the personnel needed to do a realistic job of design, implementation, data collection, analysis, and whatever sorts of tasks are designed and involved in the plan. Every step needs to be considered, and all of the work and all of the materials and everything that goes into that needs to be considered too. So think about all of the steps that you will have to go through. Then make a list of all of the tasks involved. You don't need to describe the tiny parts of an established process, such as running immunoassays or performing electrospinning or chromatography or whatever. But you will have to list each process and evaluative action that you plan to take. You should also make sure that any personnel roles and materials and other costs needed are discussed. Anything that you intend to ask for funding in the grant for should play a role in the detailed plan. After all, if it has no place in the plan, why should they fund it? Hopefully you see what I mean there. So, the role of each expenditure needs to have a place in your detailed plan. You also want to account for the probable schedule and how long various activities are likely to take. A realistic schedule will help the reviewers see that you have thought through exactly how much you can accomplish in the sponsored time frame. A good approach is to make a table that enumerates each step and activity that you will go through, the time frame that you expect to perform it during, who will be doing it, and what expenses will be incurred in the process. A table like this can take up a lot of space, but also shows everything in an organized way that demonstrates the connections clearly. So, let me make an example of how that might work for a mock project, comparing 2 multimedia tools for teaching math to a group of students with a third comparison group for control. I'll assume that before the start of the project, I have recruited partners that can provide the students. Having these kinds of resources in place before the proposal and getting letters of commitment to show the resources are in place in advance is important before the proposal is submitted. So, once funding arrives, the first thing I would need to do is start designing the 2 multimedia tools. That should involve the PI, me for this example, and an instructional designer. The instructional designer is probably what we call key personnel in government funding. We'll talk about terms like that more in the next module. The next step would be training 2 teaching assistants on how to administer the multimedia tools and train partner teachers on them. Always remember to include those things like hiring and onboarding personnel and training time to make a realistic timeline for your detailed plan. Next after that would be training for undergraduate student researchers to assist with observations and data collection. Why 4? Because I want 2 to be assigned to the control group, to make sure that 2 people go into each of the 3 groups so that the intervention and control groups are similar as possible in their conditions. Then would be the field work. The TAs and student research assistants, along with the PI, going out into the 3 randomly assigned student groups to implement the multimedia tools or to show whatever control video is assigned to the control group. Somewhere in my application, I should make sure to say that I have full IRB approval and any other compliance items for doing this. It doesn't need to be in the detailed plan, but somewhere in my text leading up to the detailed plan, I have to have already discussed the research plan and how it fulfills the goals of the program and how it is tied to the literature in the field. And when I do that in the narrative, I should mention IRB compliance as well. That's just a note to remind you of the bigger application context. Okay, so after the multimedia tools have been used in the classrooms, then post-field work data analysis and follow-up data collection would be the next step. We'll assume all 6 of my students are on the initial data analysis and follow-up collection team. But of course, the data analysis plan could have a big effect on how many are really needed. Keep in mind that reviewers and POs see a lot of research planned and have a good sense of what an analysis takes, so plan appropriately. I'll guess that final analysis will only need half of the team after the preliminary coding and analysis is done, so let's guess I'll keep 2 TAs and 1 undergraduate research assistant for that and let go the other 3 undergraduate research assistants at this stage. Okay, then we have a reporting and dissemination stage. Reporting is the final findings and reports to the funding agency, while dissemination is sharing findings with the larger scholarly community. So dissemination activities would include travel to a conference or 2 and publishing in a journal. That's why I have travel costs here. And in some fields, you need page fees for publishing as well. It's good mentoring to co-present with the grad students, the TAs, and include their conference travel in the grant, but admittedly, that is not always approved in these times of shrinking budgets. So that's my detailed plan. I tried to pick a simple example and make the detailed plan straightforward. There are definitely things that I could include that I didn't. One might be a pre-fieldwork data collection stage for comparison. And it would be good to have a more detailed design phase for creating the multimedia tools that might break out sub-stages of design like core programming, interface design, and usability testing. If I plan to have a bigger design team like 2 programmers on, then breaking out those stages and which person works on which task would be essential. Remember that each person you hire needs to have their stage and role listed. And I could have added more steps listed out, but I didn't want to make this detailed plan overwhelming. For your purposes, my suggestion is this: add as much detail as you can. Add all of the details you would if you were describing a project protocol for a class. You can always combine later if you need to for space, but more detail is always better in the detailed plan. So, where does this detailed plan fit in the larger narrative? Basically, put it after everything you would need to have to explain it, and before everything that is intended to follow up on the plan. Most likely, the result should have the narrative starting with the goals and your responses to the goals, then proceeding to definitions and explanations, then the project concept with literature backing it up, and then the detailed plan itself. Then afterwards, moving towards the end will usually have anticipated takeaways, potential impacts on the field, and finally big picture impacts and the why factor to sum up the value. But of course, the best narrative is the one that flows naturally for you. This is just one possible structure in case you're not sure how to translate the outline into a larger flow. But go with that logical flow process that you worked out earlier and put the detailed plan where it fits best in that logic. You're the expert. The flow of the science should be controlling a lot of the flow of the narrative, and you know the science best. Okay, thanks for listening. This is Nina signing off, mini lecture 8 of the UNC Systems PSM program series on the fundamentals of grantsmanship.